There is a field in Wiltshire, England, where the grass grows a little too flat, the soil a little too rich, and the silence a little too deep. Farmers have ploughed it for centuries. Children have run across it. Tourists have driven past it on their way to something more famous just down the road. And almost none of them know that underneath their feet, pressed into the chalk like a whisper that refuses to die, lie the foundations of a world that should not have been forgotten. We talk about Stonehenge like it appeared from nowhere, like some ancient and instinctive people dragged a few rocks into a circle and called it civilization. But that is not what happened, not even close. The people who built Stonehenge were not the first. They were not even close to the first. By the time the first stone was raised on Salisbury Plain, Britain had already been home to a sophisticated, connected, monument-building civilization for over 1,000 years. A civilization with its own rituals, its own trade routes, its own understanding of the sky, its own way of burying its dead and honoring its gods. A civilization that stretched from the tip of Cornwall to the northern reaches of Scotland. A civilization that built structures so large and so carefully planned that modern engineers still struggle to explain how they were moved. And then, in what archaeologists now believe was the span of just a few generations, that civilization was gone. Not conquered, not absorbed, not gradually replaced. Gone. The genetic signature of the people who built Britain's first great monuments, who farmed its first fields, who raised its first stone circles, who organized its first large communities, who traded goods across hundreds of miles of prehistoric landscape, that genetic signature essentially vanishes from the British archaeological record. Studies of ancient DNA, extracted from Neolithic bones, and compared to DNA from the people who come after them, show a population replacement so thorough, so complete, that some researchers have described it as one of the most dramatic demographic events in all of European prehistory. Who were these people? What did they build? How did they live? And what happened to them? These are the questions that keep archaeologists awake at night. These are the questions that, as we dig deeper into the science and the soil of Britain, are slowly, carefully, painstakingly being answered. And the answers are more extraordinary than most people realize. Let's go back, a long way back. Around 12,000 years ago, as the last great ice age loosened its grip on the northern world, Britain was not yet an island. It was a peninsula, a wide, flat, marshy extension of the European continent, connected to what is now the Netherlands and Denmark by a vast, low-lying plain that geologists call Doggerland. Across this plain, hunter-gatherers moved with the seasons, following herds of deer, wild horses, and aurochs, the enormous wild cattle that once roamed Europe. The climate was warming, the glaciers were retreating, and the landscape was slowly transforming from tundra to forest, from bare rock to lush green. The people who lived here were not primitive. That word gets thrown around too casually when we talk about prehistoric people, and it is almost always wrong. These were fully modern human beings with the same cognitive capacity as anyone alive today. They made complex tools from flint, bone, and antler. They had language. They had art. They understood the movements of animals across hundreds of square miles of landscape. They carried knowledge of plants and healing and seasonal cycles that had been accumulated and refined over thousands of years. They were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily intelligent and extraordinarily capable. They just expressed that intelligence in ways that left fewer obvious traces in the ground. They lived in small, mobile groups, probably extended family bands of between 20 and 50 people. They built shelters from wood and animal hide, structures that were deliberately impermanent because permanence would have worked against them. To be rooted in one place, dependent on the resources of a single patch of ground, would have been a vulnerability in a world where the land itself was still shifting and settling after the Ice Age. Mobility was survival. Movement was intelligence. For thousands of years, Britain was theirs. We know this because of the traces they left behind. The worked flint scattered across ancient lake beds and river terraces, the bones of the animals they hunted, the hazelnut shells that cluster around the remains of hearth fires, the occasional burial that gives us a glimpse of a face. At a site called Starcar in North Yorkshire, archaeologists found headdresses made from red deer skulls, the antlers still attached, worn probably in ritual or ceremony, or the kind of sympathetic hunting magic that similar cultures have practiced around the world. These were not people stumbling through existence. These were people with a rich inner life, a sophisticated relationship with the world around them, and a deep understanding of what it meant to be human. But around 6,000 years ago, something changed. Something that would transform Britain so completely that the world of those early hunter-gatherers would effectively cease to exist within a few centuries. Not overnight, not in a single dramatic event, but relentlessly, irreversibly, with the slow momentum of a wave that builds far out at sea before it crashes on the shore. Farming arrived in Britain. This needs to be understood properly, because the arrival of farming was not just a change in how people got their food, it was a revolution in almost every aspect of human existence. It changed the relationship between people and land. It changed social structures. It changed population densities. It changed the way people understood time, because farming requires planning across seasons and years in a way that hunting and gathering does not. It changed the way people understood ownership, because when you clear a field and plant a crop and invest months of labor in a patch of ground, that ground becomes yours in a way that a forest you pass through never can. And it changed, perhaps most profoundly, the relationship between the living and the dead, because farmers do not move on. Farmers stay, and when you stay in one place, you build things that outlast you. You create monuments, you create memory, you create what we might, cautiously and carefully, call civilization. The farming revolution had been spreading across Europe for thousands of years by the time it reached Britain. It had started in the Near East, in the Fertile Crescent of the modern Middle East, where the wild ancestors of wheat and barley grew alongside the wild ancestors of sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. People there had learned, gradually and through enormous accumulated trial and error, how to cultivate these plants and manage these animals. And the knowledge had spread, carried partly by diffusion, by neighboring communities teaching one another, and partly by migration, by farming people themselves moving westward across Europe, generation by generation, establishing new communities, pushing into new landscapes. The genetic evidence is now very clear on this point. The people who brought farming to Britain were not primarily the descendants of the hunter-gatherers who were already there. They were migrants, newcomers, people whose ancestry traced back ultimately to the Near East and who had been spreading westward across Europe for millennia. They were, by the time they reached Britain, a thoroughly European people with a genetic heritage that mixed Near Eastern farming ancestry with European hunter-gatherer ancestry, picked up during thousands of years of westward movement. But they were biologically, culturally, and probably linguistically distinct from the people already living in Britain. And so began, around 4000 BCE, the great Neolithic transformation of Britain. The word Neolithic means New Stone Age, and it describes the period when farming, pottery, and the permanent settlement of landscapes began to replace the older hunter-gatherer way of life. But that definition barely scratches the surface of what the British Neolithic actually was, because the people who arrived in Britain around 6,000 years ago did not just bring wheat and cattle. They brought an entire worldview, a way of understanding the relationship between the living, the dead, and the landscape that would produce some of the most extraordinary monuments in human history. Let us talk about what they built, because this is where the story gets genuinely astonishing. The first great monuments of Neolithic Britain were the long barrows, enormous earthen mounds, sometimes stretching for hundreds of feet, built over timber or stone chambers where the dead were laid. These were not simple graves. They were architectural achievements of considerable sophistication, and they were also something far more than places to put bodies. They were, in every sense that matters, temples, houses of the ancestors, places where the living came to commune with the dead, to seek guidance, to perform rituals, to maintain the relationship between the generations that had passed and the generations still to come. The chambers inside these monuments were carefully designed. At West Kennet Long Barrow in Wiltshire, one of the best preserved in Britain, the entrance passage leads into a series of side chambers lined with massive upright stones, and the bones of the dead were arranged with deliberate care. Not just dumped in, but organized, curated, sometimes disarticulated and rearranged over time as new individuals were added. The bones of different people were mixed together, as if individual identity mattered less than collective ancestral identity, as if what was being created here was not a cemetery, but a communal ancestor, a single great being composed of many. We find evidence of feasting at these monuments: animal bones, pottery sherds, the remnants of meals shared in the presence of the dead. We find evidence of fire, of burning, of ritual activity that we cannot fully interpret, but that clearly involved considerable communal effort. These were not quiet, private places of grief. They were active, living centers of community ritual, and they were everywhere. Across what is now England, Wales, and Scotland, archaeologists have identified hundreds of long barrows and chambered cairns. The stone-built equivalents found in areas where good building stone was available. The Cotswolds alone contain dozens of them. The Orkney Islands, far to the north of Scotland, have chambered cairns of breathtaking sophistication. The Severn estuary region has some of the largest. The Welsh borders, the chalk downs of Wessex, the limestone plateaus of the Peak District. All of these landscapes were dotted with the monuments of this early Neolithic civilization. Consider what this means. To build a long barrow, you needed a community capable of sustained cooperative effort over an extended period. You needed people to dig the ditches and pile the earth. You needed people to quarry or gather the stone. You needed people to transport materials, sometimes over considerable distances. You needed people who understood how to construct stable chambers that would not collapse over decades or centuries. You needed people to organize the work, to feed and coordinate the workers, to maintain the vision of the finished monument from beginning to end. This was not the work of scattered, isolated individuals. This was the work of organized communities. And there is more. Because the long barrows, impressive as they are, were just the beginning. Around 3700 BCE, a new type of monument began to appear in the British Neolithic landscape: the causewayed enclosure. These were large, roughly circular areas enclosed by multiple concentric ditches and banks, with deliberate gaps, the causeways, crossing the ditches to allow entry. They range in size from a few acres to dozens of acres. They are found across southern England in particular, though examples exist elsewhere in Britain and across much of Western Europe, and they are, archaeologically speaking, genuinely puzzling. They do not look like settlements, not primarily at least. The ditches are too irregular, the causeways too numerous. The evidence of intensive domestic occupation too intermittent. They look, instead, like gathering places. Places where people from a wide surrounding region came together periodically, perhaps seasonally, perhaps for specific ritual occasions, and the evidence found in their ditches, the broken pottery, the animal bones, the human bones sometimes, the quernstones for grinding grain, the leaf-shaped arrowheads, supports this interpretation of periodic, intense communal activity interspersed with long periods of apparent abandonment. Windmill Hill in Wiltshire is perhaps the most famous causewayed enclosure in Britain. It sits on a hill above the Vale of Pewsey, enclosing about 20 acres within its 3 concentric circuits of ditches and banks. The material found there speaks of a community, or more likely a loose confederation of communities, gathering regularly over many centuries. Pottery styles from the ditches span hundreds of years of use. The animal bones suggest large-scale feasting, cattle slaughtered in quantities far beyond what a small local community would need. Objects from distant parts of Britain appear, hinting at the movement of people and goods across considerable distances. Windmill Hill was not unique. Hambledon Hill in Dorset enclosed a much larger area and shows evidence of intense, long-term use. Robin Hood's Ball, also in Wiltshire, sits not far from where Stonehenge would later be built. Briar Hill in Northamptonshire, Crickley Hill in Gloucestershire, Orsett in Essex. Dozens of these sites exist across Britain, and every one of them speaks of organised communities capable of creating and maintaining shared sacred or social spaces on a remarkable scale. But even these monuments, impressive as they are, were exceeded by what came next. The Cursus monuments are among the most enigmatic structures in the entire British prehistoric landscape. They are long, narrow enclosures defined by parallel banks and ditches, sometimes stretching for miles across the landscape. The Greater Stonehenge Cursus, running northeast of the later Stone Circle, is nearly 2 miles long and up to 500 feet wide. The Dorset Cursus is nearly 7 miles long, making it the longest Neolithic monument in Britain. The Bedford Cursus, the Drayton Cursus, the Springfield Cursus in Essex, the list goes on. Britain is littered with these extraordinary structures, most of them visible only from the air or as subtle crop marks in dry summers. Nobody knows exactly what they were for. That is an honest statement. Some researchers believe they were processional ways, routes along which the living carried their dead, or along which ritual processions moved in connection with the movements of the sun or moon. Others see them as boundaries, markers between different kinds of space, the everyday and the sacred, the world of the living and the world of the dead. Others suggest they were connected to the veneration of the ancestors, constructed to align with older monuments or natural landscape features in ways that expressed complex cosmological ideas. Whatever they were, they required enormous amounts of labor to construct. The Dorset Cursus alone involved moving tens of thousands of tons of chalk. This was not a casual undertaking. This was not the work of a handful of people with an afternoon to spare. This was a civilization mobilizing its collective resources in service of an idea, an intention, a purpose that mattered enough to justify years of coordinated effort. And then, of course, there were the stone circles. Before Stonehenge, there were hundreds of stone circles across Britain and Ireland. The stone circle tradition is older than Stonehenge, and it is more widespread. From the magnificent Ring of Brodgar in Orkney to the Hurlers on Bodmin Moor in Cornwall, from Castlerig in the Lake District to the Rollright Stones in Oxfordshire, Britain was covered in these extraordinary structures. Some are large and imposing, some are small and easily missed. Some are made of massive standing stones carefully shaped and positioned. Some are made of smaller, rougher stones, arranged with apparent care. But all of them represent the same fundamental impulse, the impulse to mark a place, to create a space, to define a relationship between earth and sky that was important enough to celebrate in stone. The people who built these circles understood astronomy. That is not a romantic exaggeration or an imposition of modern desires onto the ancient past. It is a straightforward conclusion from the evidence. Many stone circles, and many of the long barrows and passage tombs that preceded them, are oriented with precision toward significant astronomical events. The midwinter sunrise, the midsummer sunset, the rising and setting of particular stars on particular dates. This was not accidental alignment. The probability calculations rule out chance for the most significant examples. The builders of these monuments were watching the sky, tracking its movements, and encoding what they observed into the landscape in permanent stone. Why? The honest answer is that we do not know exactly, but we can make informed guesses. Farming depends on knowing when to plant and when to harvest, knowing when winter is truly past and spring has arrived, knowing when the nights will start lengthening again. A monument that marks the midsummer sunset or the midwinter sunrise is, among other things, a calendar in stone, a permanent, communal, awe-inspiring calendar that also serves as a ritual center, a gathering place, and a statement about who built it and who it belongs to. The knowledge required to build such monuments, the ability to track astronomical cycles across years and decades, to translate that knowledge into architectural form, to organize the labor required to quarry, transport, and erect massive stones. This was not accidental knowledge. It was accumulated, practiced, and transmitted across generations. It was, in every meaningful sense of the word, a learned and sophisticated tradition. Now let us talk about Orkney, because if you want to understand how sophisticated the pre-Stonehenge civilization of Britain really was, you need to go to Orkney. Orkney is a group of islands off the northern tip of Scotland, battered by Atlantic storms for much of the year, treeless, seemingly remote, and to the casual glance, an unlikely home for one of the most remarkable concentrations of Neolithic monuments anywhere in the world. But that casual glance would be wrong, because 5,000 years ago, Orkney was not remote, it was connected. It sat at a nexus of sea routes that linked Scotland, Ireland, and northern Britain. Its fertile soils supported substantial farming communities, and its Neolithic inhabitants built things that still astonish. The Ness of Brodgar is perhaps the most significant archaeological site in Britain that most people have never heard of. It is a promontory of land between two lochs on the Orkney mainland, and it contains the remains of a complex of massive stone buildings that archaeologists are still only beginning to understand. The buildings are large by any standard, not just Neolithic standards. One structure, now called the Great Temple, or Structure 10, covers more than 1,000 square feet and has walls over a meter thick. The walls show evidence of elaborate decoration in the form of geometric patterns carved and painted on the stone. The floors show evidence of burning, feasting, and ritual activity spanning centuries. The complex appears to have been deliberately and ceremonially demolished, its stones buried under a great mound of cattle bones and pottery at the end of its use. Surrounding the Ness of Brodgar are monuments that together form a ritual landscape of staggering ambition. The Ring of Brodgar is a stone circle over 300 feet in diameter, originally containing perhaps 60 standing stones, surrounded by a deep, rock-cut ditch that required the removal of tens of thousands of tons of bedrock. The stones of Stennis, perhaps the earliest stone circle in Britain, dating to around 3,100 of BCE, has stones over 6 meters tall, making them among the tallest standing stones in the country. Maeshowe is a chambered cairn so precisely oriented that the midwinter sunset illuminates its central chamber through the entrance passage for a few days each year, a phenomenon that requires not just astronomical knowledge, but extraordinary architectural precision. Maeshowe deserves a moment of particular attention because it illustrates something important about the civilization that built it. The chamber is constructed from enormous flagstones, some weighing several tons, fitted together with a precision that requires no mortar. The corbelled roof rises to a height of several meters, each course of stone precisely overlapping the last, to create a structure that has stood for 5,000 years without significant movement or decay. The workmanship is, by any objective measure, beautiful. Not just functional, beautiful. Whoever built Meishui cared not just about whether the structure would stand, but about how it looked, how it felt, what it communicated about the people who made it and the beliefs they held. And Meisho was not unique. The cairn at Newgrange in Ireland, constructed around the same time, has a roof box above its entrance precisely calibrated to admit the rays of the midwinter sunrise into the central chamber for a few minutes each year. The precision required to achieve this is extraordinary. The corbelled roof of Newgrange has kept the central chamber perfectly dry for 5,000 years, a feat that medieval cathedral builders would have envied. Across the island of Britain and Ireland, dozens of passage tombs and chambered cairns demonstrate the same extraordinary combination of astronomical knowledge, engineering skill, and aesthetic sophistication. This was a civilization, not a civilization in the ancient Greek or Roman sense, not a civilization of cities and writing and complex bureaucracy, but a civilization nonetheless. A civilization defined by shared beliefs and shared practices, by trade networks and communication routes, by monument-building traditions that expressed a coherent understanding of the world, by communities capable of sustained, cooperative effort across generations. How big was this civilization? How many people are we talking about? Population estimates for Neolithic Britain are difficult and contested. The archaeological evidence gives us occupation sites and monuments, but not straightforward headcounts. Nonetheless, most estimates suggest that the population of Neolithic Britain at its height, around 3000 BCE, was somewhere in the range of 100,000 to 200,000 people. Spread across an island of around 90,000 square miles, this is a relatively sparse population by modern standards. But it is far from negligible. It represents tens of thousands of farming communities, scattered across the landscape, connected by shared traditions and periodic gatherings, creating and maintaining a cultural world of considerable depth and sophistication. Those connections matter, because one of the things that the archaeological evidence makes very clear is that Neolithic Britain was not a collection of isolated local communities. It was a connected world, a world where ideas, objects, and people moved across surprisingly long distances with surprising regularity. Consider the axes. Stone axes are among the most common artifacts found in British Neolithic sites, and analysis of the stone from which they are made has revealed something extraordinary. Many axes found in the south of England are made from stone that came from specific quarry sites in Wales, in the Lake District, in Scotland, in Cornwall. The Great Langdale quarry site in Cumbria was producing polished stone axes that ended up hundreds of miles from their place of manufacture. The Graig Lwyd site in North Wales, the Tiva Bwliog site in Northern Ireland, specific outcrops in Cornwall and Devon and the Scottish Highlands, all of these were producing axes that moved across the entire landscape of Britain. This was not casual exchange. The distances involved, hundreds of miles in some cases, were substantial in a world where the fastest travel was on foot or by small boat. The effort required to move these objects speaks of trade networks with real organization behind them, routes and relationships, and perhaps specialized traders, people whose role was to move goods between communities. It speaks of a world where communities, separated by considerable distance, nevertheless maintained ongoing relationships with one another. Relationships expressed through the exchange of objects that carried meaning as well as utility. Precious objects were not the only things moving. Ideas were moving too. The monument-building tradition itself shows this. The causewayed enclosures, the long barrows, the stone circles. These types of monuments appear across Britain in ways that suggest a shared cultural tradition, not a set of independent local inventions. The chambered tombs of Orkney are related, in design and in function, to the chambered tombs of the Severn Estuary, 2,000 kilometres to the south. The stone circles of the Lake District share formal characteristics with the stone circles of Wiltshire. Across vast distances of landscape and sea, communities were participating in the same broad cultural tradition, building the same kinds of monuments, practicing the same kinds of rituals, sharing the same basic understanding of the world. How was this connection maintained? Through the gathering places, the causewayed enclosures, the great stone circles, the ritual landscapes like the one that would eventually include Stonehenge. These were places where people from a wide region came together periodically. They came to trade, they came to conduct rituals, they came to negotiate marriages and alliances. They came to feast together and to participate in ceremonies that reinforced their shared identity. And when they went home, they carried with them not just the objects they had acquired through trade, but the ideas, the innovations, the cultural developments that had been shared in the gathering place. This is how civilization spreads without writing, not through books or records or formal education, but through the circulation of people and objects and stories, through the gathering places where the accumulated knowledge of many communities is shared and renewed, through the movement of specialists, craftspeople, ritualists, healers, whose knowledge made them welcome in communities far from their place of birth. And it was working. For roughly 1,000 years, from around 4000 BCE to around 3000 BCE, this civilization flourished. Monuments were built and rebuilt. Communities expanded, trade networks extended and intensified. The ritual landscape grew more complex, more elaborate, more ambitious. Around 3000 BCE, something shifted. The long barrows largely went out of use, their entrances sometimes deliberately blocked, their chambers sealed. The causewayed enclosures were abandoned or transformed, their old functions perhaps transferred to new kinds of sacred space. And something new began to emerge in the British landscape. Something grander, something more impressive, something that suggests a civilization at the peak of its ambition. The henge monuments began to appear. A henge is a specific type of monument, technically defined as a circular area enclosed by a bank and an internal ditch, which is the opposite of a defensive structure, where you would always put the bank outside the ditch to make it harder for attackers to cross. The inward-facing ditch of a henge makes no defensive sense at all. It is, instead, a ritual boundary, a line that defines the inside as different from the outside, that marks the transition from ordinary space to sacred space. The bank outside actually makes it harder to see in from the surrounding landscape, creating a kind of secrecy or exclusivity about the rituals performed within. Hundreds of henges were built across Britain in the period around 3000 to 2500 BCE. They range from small, intimate enclosures, just a few tens of meters across, to enormous monuments covering many acres. Some were simple earthworks, some had wooden posts inside them, some had stone circles, some had both. The variety is extraordinary, and it speaks of a tradition that was being adapted and refined across different regional communities, while maintaining enough shared formal characteristics to be recognizable as part of the same broad cultural impulse. The largest henges are staggering in their scale. Avebury in Wiltshire encloses over 28 acres within its bank and ditch, making it the largest stone circle in the world. The bank, originally much more impressive than its current eroded state suggests, would have stood perhaps 5 meters high. The ditch, cut through solid chalk, was originally 9 meters deep and 21 meters wide, dug with antler picks and ox shoulder blades used as shovels, with the chalk carried out in baskets. The stone circle that stands within the bank originally contained around 100 massive standing stones, some weighing tens of tons. Inside the main circle, 2 smaller stone circles were constructed, one of which originally contained the obelisk, a single massive monolith, perhaps 6 meters tall. The whole complex was approached by 2 stone-lined avenues stretching for miles across the surrounding landscape. To build Avebury required something in the order of 10 million person-hours of labor. 10 million hours. If you gathered 1,000 people and had them work 8 hours a day, every day, it would take more than 3,000 days, nearly 9 years, just to hit that figure. And that is before you account for the logistics of feeding those workers, coordinating their efforts, maintaining the social organization required to keep such a project going over years and decades. Who built Avebury? The same civilization that built the long barrows and the causewayed enclosures. The Neolithic farmers of Britain, the descendants of those early migrants who had brought farming to the island 2,000 years before. By this point, they had been farming British soil for 80 generations. This was their landscape, their homeland, the land their ancestors had shaped and been shaped by for centuries. When they built Avebury, they were not just constructing a monument. They were expressing ownership. They were saying, in the most permanent and unmistakable language available to them, that this place is ours, that our ancestors made it, and that we will make it even more glorious. And in the shadow of this most magnificent of all henge monuments, perhaps in the same generation, the first stones were raised at Stonehenge. Stonehenge is famous precisely because it is extraordinary, but it is important to understand that it was extraordinary in the context of an already extraordinary tradition. It was not a sudden miracle. It was the culmination of a long development, the most ambitious single monument in a civilization that had been building ambitious monuments for over 1,000 years. The earliest phase of Stonehenge, around 3000 BCE, was a henge of the familiar type, a circular bank and ditch enclosing an area of about 100 meters in diameter. Inside this earthwork were a series of pits, some of which contained cremated human remains. The monument at this stage was already a place of the dead, already a place of considerable ritual significance. But it was not yet the structure we recognize. Around 2500 BCE, something changed at Stonehenge, something that would push it from the impressive to the genuinely extraordinary. The bluestones arrived. The bluestones are a group of roughly 80 standing stones at Stonehenge, each weighing between 2 and 5 tons, made of a distinctive type of spotted dolerite and other volcanic rock types that do not occur anywhere in Wiltshire. They come from the Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire, Wales, a distance of roughly 250 miles from Stonehenge. And there is now strong evidence that they were not simply quarried and transported to Salisbury Plain. They were first used in a stone circle in Wales, perhaps as a monument in their own right, before being dismantled and brought to Stonehenge. Think about that for a moment. These people did not just quarry stones and bring them to Stonehenge. They transported an existing monument, an existing sacred structure, from Wales to England. They moved the bones, so to speak, of a holy place, and reinstalled them in their new monument. This speaks of a level of ritual thinking, of cosmological intent, that goes far beyond the merely practical. How did they move the bluestones? This has been the subject of debate and experimentation for decades. The most likely answer involves a combination of overland transport on wooden sledges and rollers, and sea and river transport on rafts or boats. The geography of Wales and southern England makes a largely coastal and river route plausible. None of this was simple. All of it required planning, organization, and sustained effort on a scale that involved many communities cooperating over an extended period. But the bluestones were not the most impressive feat of Stonehenge's construction. The sarsen stones were. The sarsen stones are the large, distinctive grey megaliths that form the iconic trilithons of Stonehenge. The structures of 2 upright stones topped by a horizontal lintel. They are made of silcrete, a very hard sandstone that occurs naturally on the Marlborough Downs, about 25 miles north of Stonehenge. The largest weigh around 25 tons. They were transported 25 miles across the Chalk Downs, a feat of engineering that modern experiments have demonstrated is achievable, but requires enormous coordinated effort. Large teams of people, wooden sledges, ropes, and the careful preparation of the route. But the transportation was only part of the challenge. Once at Stonehenge, the stones had to be erected. The upright stones of the outer circle had to be raised into prepared stone holes. The lintels, each weighing around 7 tons, had to be lifted to the tops of the uprights, nearly 5 meters above the ground. The lintels are not just placed on top. They are fixed to the uprights by mortise and tenon joints, a woodworking technique applied to stone, with rounded projections on the tops of the uprights, fitting into corresponding hollows, carved into the underside of the lintels. And the lintels are connected to each other by tongue and groove joints, creating a continuous, stable ring at the top of the outer circle. This is not primitive construction. This is sophisticated construction. The application of joinery techniques to massive stone megaliths demonstrates a level of craft and planning that commands genuine respect. The people who built Stonehenge were not stumbling through the task. They knew what they were doing. The Sarsen circle at Stonehenge is also precisely arranged. The stones are not randomly spaced. The heights of individual stones are carefully graduated to account for the natural slope of the site, so that the tops of all the stones in the outer circle are at the same height above sea level, creating a perfectly level visual line, even though the ground they stand on is not perfectly level. This required not just measurement, but sustained attention to a design concept across the entire construction process. And the most famous aspect of Stonehenge, its astronomical alignment. The way the sunrise on the summer solstice falls directly over the heelstone and into the center of the monument. This was not an accident. It was not a coincidence. It was designed. Whoever planned Stonehenge was working from an astronomical understanding, sophisticated enough to align a massive stone circle with the rising point of the sun on the longest day of the year to a precision measurable in fractions of a degree. This civilization, this culture, that had been developing and flourishing in Britain for 1,000 years, reached its peak at roughly the same time as Stonehenge was being completed. Around 2500 BCE, the monuments of the Stonehenge landscape were perhaps the most impressive concentration of large-scale ritual architecture anywhere in the world outside of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Stonehenge itself, Avebury and its avenues, the Silbury Hill Mound, the West Kennet Long Barrow, the Windmill Hill causewayed enclosure, the sanctuary, the various smaller henges and stone circles scattered across the landscape of the Marlborough Downs and Salisbury Plain. This was a ritual landscape of extraordinary density and complexity, the product of centuries of accumulated effort, the expression of a civilization at the height of its powers. And then it ended. Not slowly, not gradually, the way all civilizations eventually fade and transform. Quickly, dramatically, in a way that the genetic evidence makes starkly clear. To understand what happened, we need to understand a revolution in archaeological science that has transformed our knowledge of prehistoric Europe in the last decade or so. Ancient DNA analysis, the extraction and sequencing of genetic material from ancient human remains, has given archaeologists a tool that previous generations could not even have imagined. Where once we could only infer migration and population change from the slow accumulation of changes in material culture, from shifts in pottery styles and monument types and burial practices, we can now directly compare the genetic profiles of ancient individuals and ask, with real precision, whether they were more closely related to the people who came before them or to the people who came from somewhere else. The results for Neolithic Britain have been extraordinary and, in many ways, devastating. A major study published in 2018, drawing on the analysis of ancient DNA from dozens of British Neolithic skeletons and comparing them to skeletons from the Bronze Age that followed, found evidence of one of the most dramatic population replacements in all of European prehistory. Within the span of just a few centuries, roughly between 2500 BCE and 2000 BCE, the genetic signature of the Neolithic population of Britain largely disappears. It is replaced almost entirely by a new genetic profile, the profile of people whose ancestry came, ultimately, from the steppes of Eurasia. These people are called, in the archaeological literature, the Beaker people. They are named for their most distinctive cultural artifact, the bell beaker, a type of finely made pottery vessel, shaped rather like an inverted bell, that appears across Western and Central Europe in a remarkably short period of time, around 2500 to 2000 BCE. The bell beaker phenomenon was known to archaeologists long before ancient DNA analysis was possible. What was debated was whether it represented the spread of a population, actual people moving across Europe and displacing those already there, or just the spread of ideas and objects through existing populations. The ancient DNA evidence has settled that debate, at least for Britain. In Britain, the Beaker people were not just a cultural phenomenon, they were a demographic one. Real people, carrying a specific genetic ancestry, moved into Britain in large numbers, and within a few generations came to dominate the genetic makeup of the population. Where did they come from? Ultimately, from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching across what is now Ukraine and Russia. The people of the steppe had, around 3000 BCE, undergone a revolution of their own. They had domesticated the horse. They had developed wheeled vehicles. They had a pastoral economy based on herding cattle and horses across the open grasslands. They were, in other words, mobile in a new and dramatic way, capable of moving people and goods across distances that farming communities, rooted in their fields, could not easily match. From the steppe, this ancestry had spread westward, through Central Europe, mixing with, and in some cases, largely replacing the farmers who had been living there. By around 2500 BCE, it had reached Western Europe, and then it crossed to Britain. The genetic evidence shows that within just a few centuries of the Beaker people's arrival in Britain, the genetic ancestry of the British population had been transformed. The Neolithic farmer ancestry, which had dominated British genomes for 2000 years, now contributed only a small fraction of the total. Steppe ancestry, brought by the Beaker people, came to dominate. By around 2000 BCE, the genetic makeup of the people living in Britain was more similar to people from the Ukrainian steppe than to the people who had built Stonehenge. This is, to put it mildly, extraordinary, and it raises an urgent question. What happened? How did a population that had been established in Britain for 2000 years, that had built some of the most impressive monuments in the ancient world, that had developed a sophisticated civilization of its own, how did that population essentially disappear within a few centuries? Three broad categories of explanation have been proposed by researchers, and the honest answer is that we do not yet know which was primarily responsible. It was probably some combination of all three, but each deserves careful consideration. The first possibility is violence, conquest, the deliberate destruction of the existing population by the incoming Beaker people. This is the darkest interpretation, and it is not without archaeological support. The Beaker people were, by the evidence of their graves, a warrior culture, or at least a culture that placed high value on martial identity. Beaker burials frequently contain weapons, copper and bronze daggers, arrowheads, wrist guards for archery, alongside the distinctive pottery. The burial rite itself, which typically involves a single individual placed in a crouched position under a round barrow, is dramatically different from the communal, egalitarian burial practices of the Neolithic, where the bones of many individuals were mingled together in collective tombs. Beaker burials celebrate the individual, specifically the male warrior archer. This is the burial of a culture that organized itself around the power and prowess of individual men. There is some evidence of violence. Skeletal remains from this period sometimes show trauma consistent with interpersonal violence, and the speed and completeness of the genetic replacement is hard to explain without some degree of coercive removal of the existing population. A peaceful integration of two populations would, you would expect, leave more evidence of genetic mixing than we actually see. The sheer dominance of the new ancestry speaks of something more drastic than simple assimilation. But we should be cautious about assuming that the story was simple or uniform. Violence may have played a role in some places and at some times without being the whole story everywhere. The second possibility is disease. This is, many researchers now argue, potentially the most important factor. The Neolithic people of Britain had been living on their island for 2,000 years, largely isolated from the diseases circulating on the European continent and beyond. Their immune systems had not been exposed to the same pathogens that people in the more connected world of continental Europe had been dealing with. And the Beaker people, coming from populations that had been interacting with a much wider range of human communities across the vast spaces of the Eurasian steppe and its extensions, may have been carrying diseases to which the Neolithic Britons had no resistance. This is not a purely speculative hypothesis. We have a documented and tragic analogy from much more recent history. When European colonizers arrived in the Americas, the indigenous populations they encountered had no immunity to diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza that Europeans had been living with for centuries. The result was catastrophic. Some estimates suggest that indigenous American populations fell by 90% or more in the century after first European contact, with disease doing far more damage than outright violence. The parallel is not perfect. The Beaker people were not colonizers in the modern political sense. They were prehistoric pastoralists moving into new territory. But the basic biology is the same. A population with limited prior exposure to certain pathogens, encountering those pathogens for the first time through contact with newcomers who are themselves largely immune, can experience population collapse of truly catastrophic proportions. There is now some ancient DNA evidence that supports this possibility. Studies have identified what appears to be an early ancestor of the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, in European samples from around 3000 BCE, not far in time from the Beaker expansion. The origins of plague are still being studied, and its role in the Neolithic collapse is not yet fully established. But the possibility that epidemic disease played a significant role in the rapid demographic change of this period is taken seriously by many researchers. The third possibility is more complicated and perhaps harder to accept emotionally, but it needs to be stated. The Neolithic population of Britain may have already been in decline before the Beaker people arrived in significant numbers. There is some archaeological evidence that the late Neolithic was a period of stress for the existing population. Monument building continued, and indeed reached its most ambitious phase, but some evidence suggests declining agricultural production in parts of Britain, possible disruption of the farming system, possible population stress. If the Neolithic civilization was already weakened, already facing challenges of its own, then the arrival of a new, vigorous, differently adapted population with new technologies, including copper and bronze metallurgy, new animal husbandry practices, and the horse, might have tipped a system already under strain into collapse. The truth is almost certainly a combination of factors. A weakened native population hit by unfamiliar diseases, possibly facing violence from or competition with the newcomers, possibly struggling with environmental or agricultural challenges of their own, declining over the course of several generations until what remained was too small and too fragmented to maintain the cultural and social institutions that had been the foundation of the civilization. A civilization does not just need people to survive, it needs enough people in enough contact with one another to maintain the accumulated knowledge and the social structures that make it what it is. The monument building tradition did not continue, not in the old way. The communal tombs were sealed and abandoned. The causewayed enclosures fell silent. The specific astronomical alignments, the specific rituals, the specific knowledge that had been encoded in the architecture of the long barrows and the stone circles, all of this was either lost or so thoroughly transformed that it became unrecognizable. Stonehenge itself continued to be used and modified, but the modifications were made by the new population, the Beaker people and their successors, who were doing something different at the site than the people who had built it. The bluestones were rearranged. The sarsen stones may have been added in their iconic trilithon arrangement in the Beaker period, though this is still debated. The site continued to function as a sacred place, but the civilization that had created it, that had embedded it in a dense web of related monuments and rituals and cosmological ideas, that civilization was gone. Let us sit with that for a moment, because it is worth the pause. 5,000 years ago, there were people living on this island who understood the movements of the sun and moon well enough to align enormous stone monuments with specific astronomical events. People who organized communities of thousands to move stones weighing 25 tons across dozens of miles of landscape. People who built underground chambers that have remained structurally sound for 50 centuries without a drop of mortar. People who maintained trade networks stretching hundreds of miles, moving polished stone axes and copper ornaments and amber beads and specific types of pottery from community to community across the whole of Britain. People who gathered in their tens of thousands at places like Avebury and Stonehenge for rituals we cannot fully understand, but can feel, in some deep place, were important. We do not know their language. We have no writing from them, no texts, no records in any conventional sense. We do not know what they called themselves, what they called their gods, what stories they told their children. We do not know the name of the person who first had the idea of bringing the bluestones from Wales, or the name of the architect who figured out how to apply mortise and tenon joints to stone lintels, or the name of the astronomer who worked out where to position the heelstone so that the midsummer sunrise would fall exactly right. We know them only through what they left in the ground, and what they left in the ground is extraordinary. But here is something that has only recently become clear, something that the modern science of genetics has revealed in a way that changes how we understand this story. The Neolithic civilization of Britain did not vanish entirely. It did not leave zero genetic trace. A small percentage of modern British DNA, somewhere in the range of a few percent in most analyses, traces to the Neolithic farmers who built Stonehenge and Avebury and Maeshowe and the West Kennet Long Barrow. It is a small fraction. It is not the dominant ancestry, but it is there. Somewhere in the genes of modern British people, mixed and diluted through 100 generations of intermarriage and population movement, is the inheritance of the people who stood at Stonehenge on a midsummer morning 5,000 years ago and watched the sun rise over the heelstone. The builders are not entirely gone. They are still here, in trace amounts, in the DNA of their descendants, lost, but not completely lost. There is something else that survived, something more tangible than genetics, the monuments themselves. Stonehenge still stands. Avebury still stands, its stones scattered and incomplete, but its great bank still rising from the Wiltshire landscape. The West Kennet Long Barrow still stands, its chamber still accessible. The bones of the Neolithic dead long since removed to museums, but the space they occupied still present. Maeshowe still stands, still oriented to the midwinter sunset, still admitting that shaft of winter light into its ancient chamber each year. The Ring of Brodgar still stands on its Orkney island, its stones rising from the ground like ancient sentinels. The stones of Stennis still stand. The hurlers on Bodmin Moor still stand. The Rollright stones still stand. The civilization that built these monuments may be gone in any practical sense. The people are gone. The language is gone. The specific beliefs and rituals and social structures are gone, but the monuments remain, permanent, stubborn, impervious to the passage of time, fully decode because we do not have the key, but a message nonetheless. And increasingly, as the tools of modern science become more powerful, we are finding new ways to read that message. We are learning things about the Neolithic civilization of Britain that were unknown, or even unknowable, just a generation ago. Take the recent work at the Stonehenge landscape, for instance. Ground-penetrating radar surveys, magnetometry surveys, LiDAR aerial scanning. These technologies have revealed in the last decade alone the existence of numerous new monuments and features in the Stonehenge landscape that were previously unknown. A line of buried pits running for nearly 2 miles near Dorrington Walls, each pit large enough to hold a standing stone. Evidence of enormous timber monuments that left no trace above ground, but have now been detected by the subtle differences in soil chemistry they created. Hidden ditches, buried features, the ghosts of structures that have long since decayed, but left their outlines in the chalk. The Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes Project, a major collaborative research program, has more than quadrupled the number of known monuments in the landscape around Stonehenge. It has revealed that what we see on the surface, dramatic as it is only a fraction of what was built in the Neolithic. The landscape around Stonehenge was saturated with monuments, with ritual structures, with the evidence of a civilization that invested extraordinary amounts of effort in this particular place over a period of centuries. And at Avebury, ongoing research continues to reveal new complexity. The Avebury landscape includes not just the Great Henge and its stone circles, but a complex network of avenues, smaller enclosures, individual standing stones, and buried features that together constitute a ritual landscape of extraordinary density. The West Kennet Avenue, the stone-lined processional way that runs from Avebury toward the sanctuary, still has many of its original stones standing. But survey work has revealed that it was even more elaborate than previously understood, with additional features along its length that have been obscured by later land use and vegetation. Silbury Hill, the enormous artificial mound at the centre of the Avebury complex, remains one of the most mysterious structures in prehistoric Europe. It is the largest man-made mound in Europe, rising to a height of about 40 meters from a base of about 5 acres, constructed from chalk and soil quarried from the surrounding landscape in a series of building phases spanning perhaps 300 years. What is it? Nobody knows. There is no chamber inside it, at least none that has been found. It was not a burial mound, or at least not primarily one. It does not align obviously with any astronomical event. It just sits there, massive and impenetrable, in the center of one of the most intensively studied prehistoric landscapes in the world, defying interpretation. The mystery of Silbury Hill is, in a way, the mystery of the whole civilization that built it. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we do not understand. The Neolithic civilization of Britain was not a simple society. It was not primitive. It was not reducible to a few generic statements about farming and megaliths and ritual. It was complex, sophisticated, internally varied, historically deep, and capable of intellectual and physical achievements that still have the power to astonish. Let us also talk about their religion, or at least about the ritual dimension of their culture, which the monuments make abundantly clear was central to everything they did. Because understanding what the civilization believed, or at least what its beliefs produced in terms of behavior and architecture, is essential to understanding what was lost when it ended. The dead were central. That much is obvious from the monuments. Long barrows, chambered cairns, passage, tombs, all of these were fundamentally about the management of the dead and the maintenance of a relationship between the living and those who had gone before. But the dead were not simply stored, they were actively engaged with. The chambers of the long barrows were returned to over generations. the bones of earlier occupants rearranged to make room for new ones. In some cases, bones from different individuals were deliberately mixed, as if creating a composite ancestral presence rather than honoring specific individuals. Human skulls were sometimes removed from burial contexts and used elsewhere, perhaps as ritual objects, perhaps as focal points for the veneration of specific ancestors. This is a fundamentally different relationship with death and with the dead than anything familiar from later British culture. In this worldview, the dead were not gone. They were present. They were part of the community in a real and active sense. The monuments that housed them were not cemeteries to be left undisturbed, but living religious spaces to be visited, tended, and used. The ancestors were available for consultation, or at least for ritual engagement. They were a resource, a source of power, a connection to a deeper past that gave meaning and legitimacy to the present. This focus on the ancestors connects probably to the importance of land. A farming community that has been on the same land for generations has a deep investment in that land, an investment that goes beyond the practical. The land holds the bones of the ancestors. The land has been shaped by the labor of generations. The land is, in a real sense, the ancestors. It is the physical manifestation of the accumulated effort and sacrifice of everyone who came before. To farm that land is to participate in an ongoing relationship with the dead. To build monuments in that land is to make that relationship visible, to assert it, to celebrate it. The astronomical dimension of the monuments suggests a religion, or at least a ritual practice, that was also keenly attentive to the movements of the sky. The sun and moon were clearly important, their risings and settings on significant days of the year encoded into the alignment of monuments across the whole of Britain. This was not simple superstition. It was sophisticated astronomical knowledge, accumulated over generations of careful observation and expressed architecturally in a way that made the knowledge collective, communal, and permanent. There may also have been beliefs about the relationship between the sky and the ancestors, between the movements of celestial bodies and the fate of the dead. The fact that so many burial monuments are oriented toward significant astronomical events suggests that the journey of the dead was in some way connected to the journey of the sun or moon. The midwinter sunrise that illuminates the chamber of Newgrange each year, the midsummer sunset that once lit the passage of Maeshowe, these alignments may have been intended to allow the light and what it represented to penetrate to where the ancestors dwelt, to renew them, to energize them, to maintain the connection between the celestial and the ancestral. We do not know, we cannot know, not with the evidence available to us. The beliefs of the Neolithic people of Britain died with them, unwritten, unrecorded. What we have are the physical expressions of those beliefs, the monuments, the bones, the objects. And from those physical expressions, we can glimpse the outlines of a worldview, rich and complex and coherent, without being able to fill in the details. But there is one more thing to be said about the religion of the Neolithic civilization of Britain, something that can be said with a degree of confidence. It was not a religion of power. The early Neolithic, in particular, shows surprisingly little evidence of social hierarchy. The long barrows house the remains of many individuals without obvious distinction between them. There are no graves of spectacular wealth, no burials that scream the power and prestige of a single individual above all others. The labor invested in the monuments was communal labor, and the monuments themselves seem to have been communal spaces, owned by no single person or family, but by the whole community, perhaps by all communities. This does not mean early Neolithic society was egalitarian in any modern sense. There were almost certainly specialists, people with particular knowledge or skills who held particular social roles. There were almost certainly leaders of some kind, people who organized the building projects and the gatherings, but the material expression of their culture does not celebrate individual power. It celebrates collective identity. The ancestors in the long barrows are mixed together. The stone circles are open to all who enter. The causewayed enclosures were gathering places for whole regions, not private spaces for elites. Contrast this with the beaker culture that replaced it. Individual burials under individual round barrows, weapons as grave goods, status objects, copper daggers, gold ornaments, differentiating the powerful from the powerless, even in death. The beaker culture was a culture of individual male prestige, of hierarchy expressed in the wealth and weaponry, buried with elite individuals. It was a fundamentally different social vision, a different answer to the question of what it means to live together as human beings. And this cultural transformation, this shift from the communal to the individual, from the collective ancestral to the heroic personal, may itself tell us something about why the Neolithic civilization fell. A society organized around collective identity and communal decision-making may be resilient against many threats, but it may also be vulnerable to more hierarchical, more militarized, more individually aggressive competitors. A culture that valorizes the warrior, that equips its dead men with daggers and bows, that celebrates individual prowess, may be better positioned to conquer than one that celebrates collective ancestors. Or perhaps the collapse had nothing to do with cultural values at all. Perhaps it was simply disease and demographics, the cold arithmetic of pathogen and immune response, playing out across a few generations of silent biological catastrophe. Perhaps the Neolithic civilization of Britain fell for the same reasons that indigenous civilizations fell before the Europeans, not because they were weaker or less sophisticated or less intelligent, but simply because they had no defense against organisms they had never encountered. We do not know. The honest answer is that we do not know exactly what happened. What we know is what the genetic evidence shows, which is that it happened, and that it happened quickly. In the centuries after the beaker population replaced the Neolithic one, Britain was transformed in other ways too. The Bronze Age brought metal technology, new kinds of social organization, new burial practices, new kinds of monuments. The round barrows of the Bronze Age dot the British landscape in their thousands, each one the tomb of a single individual, usually a man, often accompanied by objects of status and wealth. The flat landscapes of Britain were peppered with these monuments in the centuries after 2000 BCE, a physical record of the new social order, one that celebrated the powerful individual rather than the collective ancestor. The great monuments of the Neolithic were not entirely abandoned. Stonehenge continued to be used. Avebury continued to attract visitors and perhaps ritual activity. But the civilization that had created these places was gone, and the people who visited them in the Bronze Age were doing something different there than the people who had built them. They were engaging with a sacred landscape that was not entirely their own, that carried memories and meanings they could sense but perhaps not fully comprehend. This, too, is not unlike other historical situations. The people of the Bronze Age stood before Stonehenge and saw something ancient and powerful, something beyond their own cultural memory, something that commanded awe, even if its original purpose was no longer fully understood. The monument outlasted the understanding, and in some ways, that is the story of Stonehenge from the Bronze Age all the way to the present day. Each subsequent generation has looked at these stones and found in them something that spoke to its own needs and beliefs. The Romans who saw Stonehenge may have imagined it as the work of giants or of gods. The medieval scholars who wrote about it imagined it as the work of Merlin. The Romantic era saw in it a Druid temple. The New Age movement made it a site of spiritual power and cosmic alignment. In each case, the interpretation said as much about the interpreters as about the monument itself. The stones absorb our projections. They are old enough and strange enough and impressive enough to accommodate almost any meaning we care to find in them. And perhaps that is part of what makes them so enduring, so persistent in the human imagination. They are a space of mystery, a place where we come up against the limits of our knowledge and our understanding, a reminder that the human story is longer and stranger and more complex than any single civilization can fully comprehend. But the people who built them were not mysterious to themselves. They were farmers and engineers, astronomers and ritualists, traders and artists, community organizers and monument builders. They were people with names and stories and beliefs, with loves and fears and ambitions. They built things that have lasted 5,000 years. They created a civilization that flourished for 1,000 years, that covered an entire island with its monuments and its ideas, that reached a level of sophistication in architecture and astronomy and social organization that deserves our genuine respect and attention. And they were erased, not slowly, not naturally, with a speed and completeness that still unsettles the researchers who have quantified it. The genetic replacement of Neolithic Britain by Beaker ancestry is one of the most complete demographic transformations ever documented in the archaeological record. Other population replacements in prehistory have left more mixing, more evidence of intermarriage and gradual assimilation. The British case is stark. The Neolithic people contributed very little to the gene pool of subsequent British populations. Within a handful of generations, they had been so thoroughly replaced that their descendants are difficult to find. What does that mean in human terms? It means that communities that had farmed the same landscapes for 60, 80, 100 generations were gone. It means that the knowledge accumulated over those generations, the specific understanding of local soils and local weather patterns and local wild resources, the knowledge of where the best flint was to be found and which routes through the landscape were passable in wet weather and which springs ran clean, all of that was lost. It means that the songs and stories and rituals that had given meaning to life in those communities, that had explained why the world was the way it was and what humans owed to the powers that governed it, all of that was silenced. It is, if you let it be, a genuinely sad story. Not just in an abstract historical sense, but in the personal, human sense of actual people with actual lives being extinguished. The woman who knew which herbs grew in the forest clearing and what ailments they could treat. The man who had memorized the precise angle of the sun on the day to begin the planting. The child who had been told the story of why the stones at the top of the hill were arranged in a circle, what they meant, who had put them there. All of them gone. But here is the thing. The stones are still there, and in the stones, however imperfectly, however incompletely, those people are still speaking. They spent their lives, and the lives of many generations before them, building things that would last. And those things have lasted, not as perfectly as they might have wished, not as comprehensibly as we might want, but they have lasted. Every year, tens of thousands of people walk up to Avebury and stand inside the largest stone circle in the world and feel, however vaguely, however inexplicably, that they are in a place where something important happened. Every midsummer, crowds gather at Stonehenge to watch the sun rise over the heelstone and feel connected to something older and larger than themselves. Every winter solstice, if you are fortunate enough to be at my show on the right day, you can stand in a chamber carved from rock 5,000 years ago and watch the light of the shortest day reach in to touch the stones. The civilization that built these things wanted to be remembered, not in the way we remember individuals, with names and dates and specific biographies. They left no names, but they built things that said to any eye willing to see them that we were here, that we understood something about the world, that we cared about the connection between the living and the dead, between the earth and the sky, between the past and the future, that we were worth remembering. They were worth remembering. The science that has revealed the tragedy of their disappearance, the ancient DNA analysis that has shown how completely they were replaced, is also the science that has shown us how sophisticated and capable they really were. The archaeogenetic studies that mapped the beaker replacement also gave us detailed information about the Neolithic population that was replaced, about where they came from, how they spread across Britain, how they were related to other Neolithic populations across Europe. They emerged from research not as anonymous primitives, but as a specific people with a specific history, with connections to the Near East and to the first European farmers, with their own internal diversity and their own long story of development and change over the 2,000 years they were in Britain. And the archaeological science that has developed alongside the genetic science is revealing new things about the civilization they built every year. The ground-penetrating radar surveys at Stonehenge and Avebury, the LiDAR scans that show the subtle earthworks of long-eroded monuments, the ongoing excavations at the Ness of Brodgar that continue to rewrite our understanding of Neolithic Orkney, the analysis of isotopes in ancient bones that can tell us where individuals grew up and what they ate, that can reveal whether the person buried under the West Kennet Long Barrow grew up locally or came from hundreds of miles away, the ancient protein analysis that is beginning to tell us what specific plant and animal species the Neolithic people were herding and growing. Every year we know more, and every year the picture that emerges is of a civilization more complex, more ambitious, more intellectually sophisticated than previous generations of researchers recognized. There is, of course, a broader lesson in the story of the Neolithic civilization of Britain, one that speaks to something more than just the specific history of one island 5,000 years ago. It is a lesson about the vulnerability of civilization itself, about the fact that the things we build, however impressive, however permanent they seem, can be ended by forces that are difficult to predict and impossible to prepare for. About the fact that the knowledge and values and beliefs that give meaning to human life are not preserved automatically, are not self-perpetuating, but need to be actively maintained and transmitted and protected. The Neolithic civilization of Britain fell, not because it was weak, not because it was ignorant or unsophisticated. It fell because of a combination of circumstances, disease, perhaps violence, perhaps internal stress, that were beyond its ability to withstand. And when it fell, most of what made it what it was lost. We should hold that knowledge lightly. We live in a civilization that seems, from the inside, permanent and obvious and inevitable. But the people standing in the forecourt of West Kennet Long Barrow 5,000 years ago, watching the midwinter sun illuminate the stones, probably felt that their world was permanent too. Probably felt that the things they had built and the knowledge they had accumulated and the rituals they had inherited from their ancestors would continue forever. They did not continue. Not exactly. Not in the form those people knew. But the stones endure. And we can still stand in them and look toward the horizon and wonder. Let us talk, in the final part of this story, about what the archaeology of the last few decades has specifically added to our picture of the civilization that was lost. Because the image of the Neolithic civilization of Britain has changed dramatically in recent decades, and the changes have almost all been in the direction of greater complexity, greater sophistication, and greater interconnection than was previously recognized. The diet of the Neolithic people, revealed through isotope analysis of their bones, was more varied and more revealing than previously understood. Early Neolithic people in Britain ate a diet that was strikingly terrestrial compared to their hunter-gatherer predecessors. The marine protein that had been a significant component of the coastal Mesolithic diet drops sharply in the Neolithic, replaced by domestic animals and cultivated plants. This tells us something about the commitment of the Neolithic people to their farming lifestyle, a commitment so total that it changed their dietary choices even in coastal areas where fish and shellfish were readily available. But isotope analysis also tells us about the movement of individual people, Studies of strontium and oxygen isotopes in tooth enamel can reveal where a person grew up, because the isotopic signature of the local water and food that forms growing teeth is specific to particular geological regions. And these studies have shown that at major Neolithic monuments, at places like Avebury and in the vicinity of Stonehenge, some of the people buried there grew up far away from where they died, not just 50 miles away, in some cases, hundreds of miles away. This is remarkable. It tells us that people were making long-distance journeys to these sacred places. They were coming from Wales, from Scotland, from the south coast, from places hundreds of miles away, making the kind of pilgrimage that we more usually associate with medieval Christianity or ancient religion in the Middle East. The pilgrimage tradition in Britain is therefore older than we thought, much older, 5,000 years older than Canterbury. The isotope evidence from Stonehenge is particularly striking. Some of the people buried in the earliest phase of Stonehenge, in the period around 3000 BCE when the monument was first established, appear to have grown up in Wales, specifically in the region of the Preseli Hills from which the bluestones were sourced. This raises an extraordinary possibility that the people who arranged for the bluestones to be moved from Wales to Wiltshire, who planned and executed that extraordinary logistical achievement, may themselves have ended up buried at the monument they helped create. The movers of the stones may rest within the circle they built. The animal bones from Neolithic feasting sites also have stories to tell. Isotope analysis of cattle and pig bones from Durrington Walls, the enormous henge complex near Stonehenge that appears to have been a settlement associated with the monument's construction, shows that animals were being brought from across Britain, Scotland, Wales, southwest England. The feast that accompanied the building and use of Stonehenge was literally a national feast, drawing people and their livestock from every corner of the island. This speaks of a level of social organization that goes well beyond what a purely local community could manage. Someone was coordinating this gathering. Someone was inviting, or at least welcoming, participants from across the whole of Britain. Someone was managing the logistics of feeding large numbers of people assembled in one place for an extended period. This was a society with the capacity for large-scale social coordination, even without the kind of centralized state apparatus that we usually associate with such capacity. How? Possibly through the religious tradition itself, the shared beliefs, the shared ritual calendar, the shared understanding of what certain places meant and when one was supposed to visit them. All of this could function as a coordinating mechanism without requiring a king or a bureaucracy. The pilgrimage tradition, the regular gathering at sacred places for important ritual occasions, the understanding that certain acts of communal labor were required by the beliefs you held, these could organize thousands of people across hundreds of miles of landscape, without any of the formal institutions we usually think of as necessary for large-scale coordination. This is, in fact, how many ancient societies operated. The mobilization of labor for monument building in prehistoric societies around the world, from the statues of Easter Island to the temples of ancient Cambodia, often happened through religious authority rather than political coercion. You did not build the monument because a king told you to. You built it because the ancestors demanded it, because your beliefs required it, because the ritual calendar called for it. The difference between religious obligation and political command can be subtle, but it is real, and the Neolithic evidence fits better with the religious model than the political one. There are also the animal bones themselves, the evidence of the feasting. The quantity of animal bones at Durrington Walls speaks of slaughter on an enormous scale, hundreds or thousands of cattle and pigs consumed at this site over the period of its use. The bones show that many of the animals were killed in late autumn or early winter, at the time of year when farming communities typically culled their herds because they could not feed the animals through the winter. If you were going to slaughter animals anyway, why not slaughter them at a gathering? Why not make the necessary act of winter culling into a communal ritual celebration? This combination of the practical and the ritual is one of the things that characterizes what we know of Neolithic society. The monument alignments that simultaneously track astronomical events and function as calendars. The gatherings at sacred sites that simultaneously serve religious purposes and function as trade fairs and marriage markets and political negotiations. The long barrows that simultaneously house the dead and serve as territorial markers and function as communal ritual centers. This was a civilization that did not separate the practical from the sacred, in the way that modern secular thinking tends to. Every practical act had a ritual dimension. Every ritual act had practical consequences. And in that integration, perhaps, lies part of what made the civilization as durable as it was. The long barrows endured for 2,000 years, not just because they were well built, but because they were maintained, visited, added to, returned to generation after generation, because they served to needs, ritual and practical and social, that were real and ongoing. The causewayed enclosures were returned to for centuries, not just out of habit, but because the gatherings they hosted were genuinely valuable to the communities that participated in them. The stone circles were not just beautiful, they were useful in the broadest sense of that word. When the civilization was replaced, all of this integration was disrupted. The new population brought its own beliefs, its own ritual practices, its own relationship with the landscape, and the dead and the sky. They may have been impressed by the monuments they found. They clearly continued to use some of them, continued to bury their dead near Stonehenge, continued to gather at Avebury. But the dense web of belief and practice and social organization that had given those places their original meaning was gone. The monuments remained, but the civilization that animated them had ended. There is one more thing I want to say about the lost civilization of Neolithic Britain, something that goes beyond the specific archaeological and genetic evidence, something about what we owe to the people who built these things. We live in a culture that has a complicated relationship with the past. On one hand, we are fascinated by ancient monuments. Stonehenge draws nearly 1 million visitors a year. The books and documentaries and educational materials about prehistoric Britain are numerous and popular. People care about this history in a way that is genuine and deep. On the other hand, we sometimes romanticize and simplify this history in ways that do the actual people a disservice. We turn them into symbols, into spiritual archetypes, into vessels for our own desires and beliefs. The New Age movement that has grown up around Stonehenge, while not without sincerity, tends to project its own spiritual concerns onto a monument whose original purpose we cannot fully know. The various modern Druid movements that claim Stonehenge as their sacred site are connected to 19th century Romanticism, not to the Neolithic civilization that actually built it. The real story is more interesting than any projection. The real story is of a civilization of farmers and engineers and astronomers and ritualists. Not mystics in white robes, but practical people solving practical problems with impressive intelligence and determination. People who looked at the landscape they lived in and decided to change it, not randomly, but deliberately, in ways that expressed their deepest beliefs about what the world was and what their place in it should be. People who built things that have lasted 5,000 years, not because they were trying to impress the future, but because they were trying to honor the past and organize the present. They deserve to be understood as well as we can understand them, not as projections of our desires, not as romantic primitives, not as mystical ancestors, but as the complicated, capable, specific human beings they were. The science that is gradually revealing more of their story, the ancient DNA analysis and the isotope studies and the geophysical surveys and the ongoing excavations, is doing something important. It is restoring to them a measure of the specificity they deserve. They were from somewhere. They came from Near Eastern farming ancestors who had moved westward, across Europe over millennia. They arrived in Britain around 4000 BCE. They farmed its soils and built its first monuments and developed a civilization that flourished for 1,000 years. They built Stonehenge and Avebury and Maeshowe. They traded stone axes across hundreds of miles. They tracked the movements of the sun and moon and encoded that knowledge in stone. They feasted with their neighbors and buried their dead in communal tombs and gathered at sacred sites for rituals we cannot fully reconstruct. And then they were replaced, quickly, completely, by a new population from the East. A few percent of their genes survive in modern British people. Their monuments survive across the British landscape. The fields they cleared are still farmland. The routes they travelled are still tracks. The landscape they shaped is still, in subtle ways, the landscape they left. And their greatest monuments still stand, still align with the solstices, still gather pilgrims and visitors from across the world, still pose questions we cannot fully answer. Who were you? What did you believe? Why did you build these things? The stones do not speak in words, but they speak. They have been speaking for 5,000 years. And as our ability to listen improves, as the science gets sharper and the interpretations get more careful, we are slowly, carefully, respectfully beginning to hear what they are saying. We were here. We understood the sky. We honored our dead. We organized our communities. We built things that would last. And 5,000 years later, standing in the shadow of the stones they raised, we can say, honestly and with genuine wonder, yes, you were here, and we remember you. If you want to understand more about the lost civilizations hidden beneath Britain's landscape, about the ancient structures that still wait to be discovered under the soil of Wiltshire and Orkney and Pembrokeshire, subscribe so you do not miss the next video. And if this story of the people who built Stonehenge before anyone built Stonehenge left you with questions, leave them in the comments. The best ones will shape the next deep dive. The video on screen now goes deeper into the specific monuments of Orkney, the extraordinary cluster of Neolithic sites that may hold the key to understanding the whole British Neolithic tradition. Click it now. But before we get there is more that needs to be said, because the story of the Neolithic civilization of Britain is not just the story of its monuments. It is the story of how people actually lived, how they organized their days, how they fed themselves and clothed themselves and healed themselves and argued with each other and fell in love. And while the evidence for daily life is inevitably thinner than the evidence for monuments, it is still substantial enough to give us a real sense of who these people were on the ground. In the mud, in the fields, in the houses they built, and the meals they cooked, and the tools they made. The settlements of Neolithic Britain are, in most cases, harder to find than the monuments. Monuments were built to last. Houses were not. The typical Neolithic house was a rectangular timber structure, perhaps 10 to 15 meters long, built from upright posts with wattle and daub walls and a thatched roof. These structures survived for as long as they were maintained and then rotted back into the ground, leaving nothing visible above the surface and only the faint discolorations of post holes and floor deposits to tell the archaeologist where they once stood. We have found them, though, at Lismore Fields in Derbyshire, at Balbredy in Aberdeenshire, where a massive timber hall over 24 meters long was built and used and burned around 3900 BCE, one of the earliest Neolithic buildings in Scotland, at Whitehorse Stone in Kent, at Yarnton in Oxfordshire. Across Britain, patient fieldwork has recovered evidence of the houses and settlements of the Neolithic farmers, and what they show is a people who invested heavily in the organization and cultivation of their landscape, who built permanent structures and maintained them, who stayed in one place long enough to create the kind of deep, local knowledge that only comes from generations of observation and experience. The Orkney settlements are again exceptional. At Skara Brae, preserved under a blanket of windblown sand until a storm uncovered it in 1850, We have one of the most complete Neolithic village sites in the world. 8 stone houses, each with its central hearth, its stone sleeping platforms, its stone dresser facing the entrance, its small cells built into the thick walls. Connected by covered passages, the whole village functioning as an integrated settlement. Warm and dry by Neolithic standards, clearly planned and clearly maintained by a community with a strong sense of how collective life should be organized. The Skara Brae houses are, by any fair assessment, comfortable, cozy even. The beds were presumably filled with heather or bracken or animal hides, and the central hearth would have kept the stone interiors warm even on the fiercest Orkney winter nights. The stone dressers, prominent in each house and facing the entrance, were probably display spaces, places where objects of significance, perhaps ritual objects, perhaps simply the household's most valued possessions, were kept visible. The overall impression is of people who took their domestic life seriously, who had definite ideas about how a house should be organized and what it should contain. And Skara Brae was not just any village. The pottery found there, the carved stone balls that are one of the most distinctive artifacts of the Scottish Neolithic, the personal ornaments, all of these connect Skara Brae to a wider Scottish and British Neolithic world. The inhabitants of this small Orkney village were not isolated primitives. They were participants in a broad cultural tradition that stretched across Britain. They had connections, maintained by sea trade and periodic movement of people, to communities hundreds of miles to the south. The objects they made and used were consistent with the material culture of their time across a very wide area. The food they ate was a combination of the domesticated and the wild. The early Neolithic diet was based on cattle and pigs and sheep and goats. The 4 main domesticated animals brought from continental Europe, supplemented by cultivated wheat and barley. But wild resources were not entirely abandoned. Red deer were hunted, wild boar were taken. Fish and shellfish, especially in coastal areas, continued to be eaten, though as noted earlier, the marine component of the diet dropped sharply compared to the preceding Mesolithic. Wild plants, berries, nuts, roots were gathered seasonally. The picture is of people who were committed farmers, but not so committed that they would ignore the resources the wider landscape provided. Cattle were perhaps the most important single element of the Neolithic economy, not just as a source of food, though they provided meat and dairy products, but as a store of wealth, a means of exchange, a measure of social status. The feasting evidence from Neolithic sites like Durrington Walls shows cattle being slaughtered in enormous quantities for communal celebrations. The cattle bones from causewayed enclosures tell a similar story. Cattle were the currency of the Neolithic world, the medium through which obligations were discharged and relationships were cemented and status was displayed. The herding of cattle across the landscape also created one of the defining features of the Neolithic countryside: trackways and drove roads, routes along which animals were moved between seasonal pastures, between settlements, between gathering places. Some of these routes, particularly the ones that followed the natural contours of the chalk uplands, may have remained in use for millennia, gradually developing into the ancient trackways that are still visible in the British landscape today. The Ridgeway, the ancient track running along the chalk escarpment of the Marlborough Downs and the Chilterns, may in its origins be a Neolithic drove road, a path worn by the feet of cattle and the people who herded them thousands of years before anyone thought to call it a road. The tools of the Neolithic were made primarily from stone, specifically from flint, which is found in abundance in the chalk geology of southern and eastern England, and which can be worked with great precision into sharp, durable tools. The Neolithic flint knappers of Britain were skilled craftspeople who produced a range of leaf-shaped arrowheads, scrapers, knives, awls, and other tools with consistent quality and evident expertise. The best Neolithic flintwork is genuinely beautiful, not just functionally adequate, but aesthetically refined, evidence of people who took pride in the quality of what they made. But Neolithic people also worked wood, bone, antler, and leather, materials that have survived in only exceptional circumstances. The wooden handles that once held stone blades, the bone needles that sewed leather garments, the antler picks that dug the ditches of Stonehenge and Avebury, the leather bags and baskets and ropes that transported the heavy stones. Almost all of this organic material is gone, vanished into the soil over 5,000 years. What remains is the stone, the imperishable testimony to a world that was far more richly equipped with tools and technology than the surviving evidence alone might suggest. The Neolithic was not the Stone Age of popular imagination, all rough edges and survival instinct. It was a period of genuine technological sophistication, of accumulated craft knowledge, of continuous innovation and refinement. The people who polished stone axes to a mirror smoothness were not doing it because they had nothing better to do. Polishing was labor-intensive. It added nothing to the functional edge of the axe. It made the axe beautiful, and beautiful meant valuable, and valuable meant powerful in the economies of the Neolithic world. The polished stone axe was simultaneously a tool and an ornament, a practical implement and a symbol of status, an object that served multiple purposes in a world where the practical and the symbolic were not cleanly separated. We should also say something about medicine, or what passed for it in the Neolithic. The skeletal evidence from long barrows and other burial contexts shows that Neolithic people experienced the full range of ailments and injuries that come with hard agricultural labor and a world without modern medicine. Arthritis is common in Neolithic skeletons. Dental disease is common. Healed fractures speak of injuries that did not prove fatal but must have been painful and limiting. Evidence of trepanation, the drilling of holes in the skull, has been found in Neolithic remains from Britain and across Europe. Some of these skulls show evidence of healing after the operation, meaning the patient survived. Someone was performing brain surgery in Neolithic Britain, and some of the patients lived. This is remarkable. Trepanation is one of the oldest and most widespread surgical procedures in the archaeological record. In Neolithic contexts, it was probably performed to relieve pressure after head injuries, or possibly to treat conditions interpreted as spiritual in origin, to release evil spirits or restore a person whose mind had been damaged or disturbed. Either way, it required knowledge, skill, courage, and some form of anesthetic or pain relief, probably plant-based, that we cannot now identify. Someone in Neolithic Britain had accumulated enough medical knowledge to drill a hole in a skull and keep the patient alive. The healers and specialists of the Neolithic community are almost entirely invisible to us. We can see the monuments they built and the bones of the dead they tended. We cannot see the herbalists and midwives and bone setters and whatever we want to call the people who performed trepanations. But they were there. They had to be. No community of the size and complexity that the Neolithic evidence suggests could have functioned without people who specialized in healing, who accumulated medical knowledge across their lifetimes and passed it on to their successors. The transmission of knowledge in a society without writing deserves more attention than it usually gets. Every complex skill in the Neolithic world, flint knapping, house building, monument construction, astronomical observation, healing, pottery making, textile production, animal husbandry, had to be learned by one person from another through demonstration and practice and correction and refinement. The knowledge of how to align a monument to the midwinter sunrise had to be passed from generation to generation across many generations before it was encoded in the permanent stone of a chambered cairn. The knowledge of which plants could ease pain or fight infection had to be accumulated through observation and experiment and transmitted through teaching. This kind of knowledge transmission is fragile in ways that written knowledge is not. A book can survive the death of its author. The spoken knowledge of a healer or an astronomer dies with the last person who holds it, unless it has been passed on. The Neolithic civilization of Britain maintained a tradition of monument building for over 1,000 years. That means the specific knowledge required to build those monuments, how to survey alignments, how to quarry and transport large stones, how to design structurally stable chambers and rings, was successfully transmitted across 40 or 50 generations. For that to work, the educational structures of Neolithic society, the apprenticeships, the mentoring relationships, the ritual transmission of specialized knowledge through initiation or similar processes, must have been robust and effective. All of that was ended by the replacement, not just the people, but the transmission networks that carried the knowledge. When the population was replaced, the teacher-student chains that had maintained the specific craft and intellectual traditions of the civilization were broken. The new population had its own knowledge, its own skills, its own traditions. They could admire and even use the monuments they found. They could not fully understand or replicate the system of knowledge that had produced them. Some things, once lost, are simply lost. There is a scientific concept that is relevant here, the concept of a threshold or tipping point in complex systems. A complex system, whether it is a population of organisms, an ecosystem, or a human civilization, can often absorb considerable stress without fundamental change. But if the stress exceeds a certain threshold, the system does not just change incrementally, it collapses. It crosses a threshold beyond which the recovery of the previous state becomes impossible. What was a stable, self-reinforcing system becomes a different system, sometimes suddenly and dramatically. The Neolithic civilization of Britain may have crossed such a threshold in the century or so around 2500 BCE. Perhaps the population was already under stress from disease or environmental challenges. Perhaps the knowledge systems were already becoming fragile. And then the Beaker people arrived, or the plague arrived, or both arrived together, and the threshold was crossed. The stable system of the Neolithic civilization became unstable. The accumulated weight of 1,000 years of tradition, of monument building and astronomical knowledge and communal ritual, was not enough to prevent the collapse. And once the collapse began, it accelerated, because the social systems that maintained the civilization, the gathering places, the transmission of knowledge, the communal labor that built and maintained the monuments, all of these required a critical mass of people committed to the tradition to function. As the population declined, the critical mass fell below the threshold required to maintain these systems. People still came to Stonehenge, people still gathered at Avebury, but fewer of them came, and they came with less purpose, and the specific meanings of the gatherings were becoming less clear, and then fewer still, and then the gathering stopped, and then the knowledge of why you would gather there and what you would do when you got there was gone. The monuments remained, the people were gone. We have dwelt considerably on the tragedy of this story, but it is worth noting, before we close, that the Neolithic civilization of Britain was not the only thing that was lost in the great upheaval of the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. The Beaker people, the newcomers who replaced the Neolithic population, also lost things in their journey westward. The steppe culture from which their ancestry ultimately came was a nomadic pastoralist culture, a culture of wide horizons and seasonal movement, and the deep knowledge of how to manage large herds of cattle and horses across vast open landscapes. Much of that knowledge was not useful in Britain, where the landscape was fragmented by rivers and valleys and dense forest, where the soils required cultivation rather than just grazing. The Beaker people adapted. They took elements of their own tradition, their burial practices, their metallurgical knowledge, their value system that celebrated the individual warrior aristocrat, and they applied them to the British landscape. They built round barrows. They worked copper and then bronze. They drank from their distinctive beakers at feasts and ceremonies. They maintained elements of the Neolithic sacred landscape, continuing to use Stonehenge and Avebury, even if they no longer fully understood their original purposes. They were, in other words, people doing what people always do when they move into a new landscape and a new situation, taking what they knew and adapting it to what they found. The Bronze Age that followed the Beaker period was, by many measures, a prosperous time in Britain. The metal technology that the Beaker people brought enabled new tools and weapons of greater effectiveness than flint could provide. Trade networks, if anything, intensified in the Bronze Age, as the raw materials for bronze, copper, and tin needed to come from specific sources and be distributed across a much wider area. The round barrow burial tradition produced extraordinary objects of wealth and artistry, gold lunulae and amber necklaces, and finely wrought bronze daggers. The people of Bronze Age Britain were, in their own way, impressive, but they were not the same civilization. The specific achievements of the Neolithic, the communal tombs with their mixed ancestral bones, the causewayed enclosures with their centuries of periodic feasting, the astronomical knowledge encoded in the alignments of the stone circles, the specific tradition of monument building that had produced Stonehenge and Avebury and Maeshowe, that tradition was over. It did not continue into the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age was a new world with new priorities and new expressions of what it meant to be human. Some of the old places continued to be used. Bronze Age people buried their dead near Stonehenge, adding to the cemetery that already surrounded it. They deposited objects at Avebury. They maintained some relationship with the old sacred sites, even as the meaning of those sites shifted and blurred. Perhaps they told stories about who had built these extraordinary structures. Perhaps they attributed them to giants or gods, to beings more powerful than ordinary humans, because the idea that ordinary humans could have built them seemed unlikely without the knowledge of how it had been done. We do not know what Bronze Age people thought about the Neolithic monuments they inherited. We do not know whether they had traditions that preserved any memory of the civilization that built them. What we know is that by the Iron Age, the stories told about Stonehenge and similar monuments in Britain had already passed into legend, already been transformed into mythology, already been detached from any historical memory of the actual civilization that produced them. By the medieval period, Stonehenge was being attributed to Merlin, the wizard of Arthurian legend. The Reverend William Stukeley, the 18th century antiquarian who first began serious study of Stonehenge and Avebury, attributed them to the Druids, the Iron Age priests who had flourished more than 1,000 years after the monuments were built. The Roman writer Diodorus Siculus, probably drawing on earlier Greek sources, described a round temple on a northern island, possibly Stonehenge, as a sanctuary of the sun god Apollo. Each era reinterpreted the monuments through its own conceptual framework because the original framework was gone. The loss of that framework is perhaps the most poignant aspect of the whole story. The monuments survived. The knowledge of why they were built, of what they meant to the people who built them, of the specific beliefs and practices and social arrangements that animated them, all of that was lost when the civilization that had created it was replaced. And what we are doing now, with our ground-penetrating radar and our ancient DNA analysis and our isotope studies and our careful fieldwork, is attempting to reconstruct, at least in outline, what was lost. We will never fully recover it. The language is gone. The specific ritual practices are gone. The names of the gods, if there were gods, and of the people, and of the places, as the Neolithic people called them, all of that is gone. But we can recover the outlines. We can demonstrate that there was a civilization here. sophisticated and complex, and capable of extraordinary achievement. We can show, with the tools of modern science, that the people who built Stonehenge were farmers and astronomers and engineers and artists. Not primitive, not childlike, not mystical in any sense that would comfort the modern New Age imagination, but genuinely, specifically, historically remarkable. And in doing that, we can give them back something of what was taken from them when they were replaced. Not their lives, not their language, not their specific knowledge, but recognition, the recognition that they existed, that they mattered, that what they built and thought and believed was worth understanding, that the civilization that covered Britain before Stonehenge and built Stonehenge and was erased from Britain, within a few generations of Stonehenge's completion, was one of the remarkable achievements of early human history. 5,000 years is a long time, but the stones are still standing, and the questions they raise about who built them and why and what happened to the people who built them, those questions are still worth asking, more than worth asking. They are, in some deep sense, questions about what we are as a species, about what we build and why we build it and how we lose what we love. The people who stood at Stonehenge on a summer morning 5,000 years ago and watched the sun rise over the heelstone were doing something that we still do. They were looking at the sky and feeling their smallness and their significance in the face of something vast and enduring. They were connecting to a past they could not fully recover and reaching toward a future they could not fully see. They were doing what humans have always done, making meaning, building things, trying to leave some trace of themselves in the world. They left the stones, and we are still here, looking at them, wondering. There is, in the history of the Neolithic civilization of Britain, a particular moment that deserves extended attention, because it illustrates better than almost anything else the scale and ambition of what was achieved. That moment is the construction of the Sarsen Circle at Stonehenge, specifically the raising of the trilithons, those iconic structures of two upright stones topped by a horizontal lintel that make Stonehenge instantly recognizable in silhouette across the whole world. To raise a trilithon, you first need to raise two upright stones. Each upright in the Great Trilithon, the tallest pair at the center of Stonehenge, weighs approximately 25 tons and stands over 7 meters tall above the current ground surface, with a further 2 meters buried below ground in the stone hole. Getting a 25-ton stone upright in a stone hole dug in chalk requires a method, and we have a reasonable understanding of what that method was, pieced together from experimental archaeology, from the physical evidence of the stones and their holes, and from ethnographic parallels with other cultures that raised large stones in the historical period. The stone would have been brought to the site on a wooden sledge, then maneuvered using timber rails and levers until its end was positioned over the edge of the prepared hole. The hole was not a simple cylinder. It had a sloped side on the approach end, so that the foot of the stone could slide into the hole as the stone was levered upright. The opposite side of the hole was lined with timbers or stakes to protect it from damage as the stone went in. Ropes, probably dozens of them, were attached to the top end of the stone, and teams of people, possibly hundreds of people, pulled simultaneously as the levers at the base raised the stone's foot into the hole. As the stone rose, it was held in place by additional timber framing and ropes until it was vertical. Then it was packed in place with stone rubble rammed tight around the base. And then, somehow, the lintel had to be raised to the tops of the two uprights. How do you lift a 7-ton stone to a height of nearly 5 meters? The most plausible answer, and the one supported by the marks and wear patterns on some of the stones themselves, is a timber crib, a platform built from interlocking timbers that could be raised incrementally. The lintel stone would be placed on rollers or timber skids at ground level and then lifted, one end at a time, by teams using long wooden levers. while the crib was built up under it. Each lift gained a small amount of height, repeated hundreds of times, each end alternately lifted, and the crib packed under it. The stone would gradually rise to the required height, and then it would be levered sideways into position on the tops of the uprights, where the mortise and tenon joints would lock it in place. All of this required timber, lots of timber. Long, straight, strong timbers of consistent diameter for the cribs and sledges and levers and rollers. Trees would have been felled, shaped, and transported in quantities that would have represented a significant deforestation of the local landscape. The labor of the carpenters who prepared the timber, the people who managed the tree, felling, and the shaping, is invisible in the final result, but was essential to it. Stonehenge was not just a stone monument, it was a timber monument too, and the timber it consumed, burned away or rotted away over the millennia, was part of the cost of its creation. And all of this is without even mentioning the most laborious single task in the whole construction, the transport of the stones. 25 miles from the Marlborough Downs to Stonehenge, over chalk downs and across river valleys, and through whatever woodland and rough ground lay along the route. For stones weighing up to 25 tons, on wooden sledges, with teams of people pulling on ropes and others maintaining the timber trackway under the sledge as it moved. The logistics, the quantity of organized human labor, required just to get the stones to the site, before any of them had been raised, was staggering. Experimental archaeology has given us a sense of scale. Teams of volunteers attempting to replicate these transport methods in modern experiments have found that moving even relatively modest stone blocks over comparable distances requires hundreds of people working in coordinated shifts. Scaling up to the sarsen stones of Stonehenge suggests that the transport phase alone required something in the order of several hundred people working continuously for weeks or months for each major stone. Multiply that by the 80-odd stones in the final monument, and you arrive at a number of person-hours that is truly impressive. Where did all those people come from? Not from a single local community. The population density of Neolithic Wiltshire, however you estimate it, could not have supplied the labor from immediate proximity alone. They came, as the isotope evidence suggests, from across Britain, from Wales, from Scotland, from the south coast, drawn to Stonehenge by the same force that draws pilgrims to sacred places in every culture and every era, the belief that the place mattered, that the work mattered, that participating in the building of this monument connected you to something larger than yourself. The seasonal pattern of the feasting evidence at Durrington Walls suggests that large numbers of people came together at the Stonehenge landscape in late autumn and again in midsummer, perhaps corresponding to the midwinter and midsummer solstice celebrations. The building of Stonehenge may have been organized around these seasonal gatherings, with labor contributed by visiting communities during the festival periods. Over years and decades, the monument would have grown, each season's gathering adding something, each generation of builders inheriting a partially completed structure from the last and adding their own contribution. This would explain the long construction period. Stonehenge was not built in a single season or a single generation. It was built and rebuilt and modified over roughly 1,500 years. From its earliest earthwork phase around 3000 BCE, through the final arrangement of the sarsen stones and bluestones in roughly the form we see today around 1500 BCE, each generation of builders was, in a real sense, having a conversation with the generations that had come before, inheriting their work and choosing how to continue or modify it. That conversation ended with the demographic replacement, the last generation of builders to work at Stonehenge with a full understanding of what they were doing, with the accumulated knowledge of the monument's history and meaning, must have seen the monument as their predecessors had built it and understood, with whatever mixture of pride and anxiety, that they were part of a long tradition. And then, within a generation or two, that tradition was broken. The people who came to Stonehenge after the replacement were coming to a monument whose complete meaning they could not fully know. It is one of the most haunting aspects of the whole story. The monument outlasted the understanding. The stones survived. The knowledge that animated them did not. Let us end with the landscape, because the landscape is where everything that happened in this story happened. Not in libraries, or on battlefields, or in courts, but in the fields and hills and river valleys of Britain, in the places where people actually lived and worked and died. The chalk downland of Wiltshire and Dorset, where Stonehenge and Avebury stand, is one of the most deeply prehistoric landscapes in Europe. The surface of the chalk holds the traces of thousands of years of human activity in a way that other, more intensively farmed or developed landscapes do not. The soils are thin, and the chalk beneath them is soft enough to preserve the marks of ancient earthworks as subtle variations in the topography. Humps and hollows and linear features that a trained eye can read like text. Walking across Salisbury Plain on a clear autumn morning, with the chalk white under a blue sky and the great stones of Stonehenge visible in the middle distance, it is possible to feel, if you allow yourself, something of what the Neolithic people felt here. Not the specific beliefs, not the specific rituals, not the specific knowledge that they brought to this place, but the landscape itself, the wide open space, the big sky, the sense of standing in a place that has been meaningful to people for an almost incomprehensible length of time, that is accessible to anyone willing to pay attention. The monuments are not just archaeological sites, they are places, in the deepest sense of that word. Places where the human relationship with landscape and sky, and death and community and meaning has been expressed and sustained for 5,000 years. Not continuously, not by the same people or the same beliefs, but persistently. Because even after the civilization that built them was gone, people kept coming back to them, kept finding them important, kept investing them with meaning, even when the original meaning was lost. That persistence is itself a kind of testimony to the people who built them. They built things compelling enough that every subsequent generation that encountered them felt the need to engage with them, to interpret them, to make them their own. The Neolithic civilization of Britain is gone, its people genetically replaced, its language silent, its specific beliefs irrecoverable. But its monuments have made it impossible to forget, even when the specific memory has been lost. We are, in this sense, still living in the shadow of the lost civilization. The landscape of Britain, shaped by 10,000 years of human habitation, carries the marks of the Neolithic deeply within it. The field boundaries and trackways and patterns of land use that developed in the Neolithic have influenced, however indirectly, the landscape that exists today. The sacred places that the Neolithic people identified and monumentalized remained sacred places through the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and the Roman period and the medieval period, sometimes with the meaning transformed beyond recognition, but the place itself retaining its significance. And now, in the 21st century, as the science of ancient DNA and isotope analysis and ground-penetrating radar continues to reveal new aspects of the Neolithic civilization, we are in the strange position of knowing more about these people than any generation since their own. We know, with a precision that would have been impossible even 50 years ago, where they came from. We know what they ate. We know where some of them grew up. We know the genetic makeup of populations across Britain and how it changed over time. We know the outlines of their social organization, their trade networks, their ritual practices, their architectural achievements. We are, in this sense, recovering them. Slowly, incompletely, imperfectly, but genuinely. The lost civilization of Neolithic Britain is less lost than it was a generation ago, And with every new excavation, every new analysis, every new application of scientific techniques to the ancient evidence, it becomes less lost still. The stones have been waiting 5,000 years for us to understand what they are trying to say. We are getting closer. Not all the way there, perhaps not ever all the way there, but closer. And that journey, the journey toward understanding the people who were here before us, the people who shaped this landscape and built these extraordinary things and were erased from it so completely and so quickly, that journey is itself a form of respect, a form of remembrance, a way of honoring the obligation we owe to the past, the obligation to know where we came from, to understand what was built and what was lost, and to recognize that the civilization we inhabit today is not the first and will not be the last. The people who built Stonehenge looked at the sky and built monuments to mark their understanding of its patterns. We look at their monuments and try to understand what they knew and what they believed. Across 5,000 years, the looking connects us. The wondering connects us. They are not entirely gone. Not as long as we keep looking.